Trajann Valoris, the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. Easily the best general guild raid buffer in Tacticus. He is used in every guild raid meta deployment outside of the Neurothrope team. What makes him so good and how do you actually trigger him? Those are the main topics of this installment of the Pain Academy video series, where I aim to teach you the important game mechanics of the game. Trajann is one of those quite hard to understand characters, but once you watch this video, you should have full insight into how he works. We are just about to finish Trajann's last legendary event, and I think a lot of players now have access to this amazing buffer. Take note that this video is just about understanding all the nuances of Trajann, not about how to optimize a battle using a Trajann-fueled raid team. We first need to fully understand Trajann and how everything interacts with his passive ability. Trajann's stats, traits and active ability are frankly quite lackluster for being the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, but Snowprint has to balance the characters of the game, of course. His resilient and martial kata traits, together with his active ability that heals and increases block chance, does mean he is more resilient than his stats would first suggest. But that is not what we're here to talk about today. What really makes this character such a monster is his passive ability. The ability text isn't long, but the ability is quite complex and difficult to fully master. Let's just say that reading it and understanding how it works are two very different things. So let's take a closer look. His passive ability is essentially two abilities in one, so let's treat them as such. I will break the ability down into effect, condition, and duration. After having considered how the first part of this ability works, we will dive into part 2 of the ability. In my next video, I will show you how to play him properly together with the Admech raid team. Following up on this, I will have a separate video explaining all the details of piloting the Lavistodes guild raid team powered by Trajann and Kharn. So part 1 of the ability. The effect is that enemies receive plus X amount of damage depending on the level. The condition is if the enemies are adjacent to a friendly unit that has used an active ability this turn. And the duration is not stated directly, but implied, which I'll come back to. So let's dig even deeper. The effect is enemies receive plus X amount of damage. What does this actually mean? Enemies receives mean that it's added to each hit of any type of damage regardless of the source as long as it is from a friendly unit. It applies to both normal attacks and abilities alike. Enemies receive and friendly units deal are powerful keywords for buffers. For instance, Calgar's passive says friendly units gain, which is a much weaker buff application, but I won't go into these details now. Just know that Khalgar is a terrible buffer for both Admech and Lavistodes. Trajann is the opposite. Note that abilities that has the disclaimer that it can't be modified are not affected by his buff. Because the buff is additive, it is added to the damage before any multipliers are added. All damage multipliers, like the Rapid Assault or Beast Slayer traits, or High Ground bonus, therefore also multiplies the damage from his buff. Understanding the condition is the most important part. The condition is if the enemy is adjacent to a friendly unit that has used an active ability. The has used means the damage buff is triggered after a unit has used an active ability and is then adjacent to that enemy. Make sure you understand this part. The buff is not triggered for the active ability itself, but after. For instance, if a character like Kharn uses Kill, Maim, Burn next to an enemy, that ability is unbuffed by Trajann, but everything attacking the enemy afterwards is buffed because Kharn is now next to the enemy and has used an active ability. When the buff is activated, it is visible on the target as a red arrow down marker. This also works on immune targets like guild raid bosses. How? It is considered a buff to characters attacking that target and not a debuff to the target itself, similar to how Eldrion's Doom works. The condition does not involve Trajann himself. Trajann can be having a Mai Tai on the other side of the map and he will still grant the buff as long as he is alive. This is why you might have seen my Trajann running around the other side of the map in my Riptide replays. He is applying his buff while blocking Riptide from fleeing the fury of the Admech. The condition does not involve which enemy unit the active ability was used against. You get the buff on enemy Y, even if you use the active against enemy X, as long as you are adjacent to enemy Y. Because the ability says unit, It is triggered by anything, not just characters. Hence the buff can be triggered by things like a Scarab Swarm using Scarab Summon, a Screamer using the Slashing Dive ability, or a character like Kharn using Kill Maim Burn. The game has several different styles of active abilities that interact with Trajann's has used trigger condition in different ways. Let's break down the different types and show examples on how they interact with Trajann's buff. Most active abilities are used in the hex a character is in and ends their turn after the ability effect. These attacks will be unbuffed but trigger the buff for everything attacking after in that turn, which is what happens for Kharn's active ability for instance. A subcategory of this type is ranged abilities. A ranged ability used at range will not trigger the buff as the character is not next to the target after the ability was used. You can, however, use ranged abilities adjacent to the target to trigger the buff. Some active abilities do not end the character's turn, which allows the character to move after using it. One such character is Ragnar. Ragnar can howl and then move next to the target, which would then trigger the buff. Ragnar even manages to buff himself without the use of another character this way. Some active abilities are activated at range and then the character charges next to the target and attacks it. Boss Golgarts is one such character. Such attacks do not gain the benefit of the buff themselves, but trigger it as the character ends adjacent to the target. Lastly, some characters have a passive ability that can happen after the character does something else. If such a character uses an active ability, that attack is not buffed, but the attack from the passive ability afterwards is. One such character is Sword Brother Godswill. His passive ability activates after moving, or at the end of the turn if he remains stationary. If he starts next to one or more targets and uses his active ability, his follow-up attack from his own passive ability will then be buffed. I hope you already understand that the conditions for activating Trajann's buff and in what sequence is important. Finally, the duration. It says this turn. The duration is linked to the condition because it says you can get the buff after an active ability has been used this turn. Since there are no characters I know of that can use an active ability in the enemy turn, and summons activate at the beginning of a player's turn, the buff can only be active in the player's own turn for the player's own characters or anything those characters reactivate. The latter part is relevant when using Trajann as a buffer for the Admech, which we will talk about in the next video. So far we have only touched on the first part of the ability and it's already quite extensive. Now let us look at the second part.
If you find my videos helpful, please consider using my friend code. This gives you 100 Blackstone and me various useful rewards as you level up. Any support is greatly appreciated.
For the second part of the ability, I have rearranged the words a bit as I think this makes it easier to understand. The effect then is: against the affected enemies, friendly characters score 2 additional hits with their first attack that is not a normal attack. The condition is if the affected enemies are also adjacent to Trajann, and the duration is unchanged. Let's go backwards this time and consider the condition first. Since it says also, we need to combine it with the previous condition as well. The combined condition would then read: if the enemies are adjacent to both Trajann and any friendly unit that has used an active ability this turn. Hence, to get the second part of the buff, everything stated earlier still applies, but we also need to move Trajann next to the target before attacking to get his extra hits. Note that this means Trajann himself can satisfy all parts of this condition if he himself uses his active ability and is adjacent to the enemy. The effect is friendly characters score 2 additional hits with their first attack that is not a normal attack against the affected enemies. This part of the ability only applies to characters, not summons or machines of war. The affected characters get 2 more hits on any non-normal hits, meaning either passive or active abilities that do damage and that can be modified. Note that normal attacks get no additional hits even if they are affected by part 1 of Trajann's ability. All characters attacking after the condition is satisfied get the extra hits, not just the first character after the buff is triggered. The extra hits only applies to the first attack that is not normal from each character. This last part is the most important to understand. A few characters do several attacks as part of their repertoire. Kharn is a good example. Let us assume that the conditions for triggering the buff has been met for the relevant enemy and see what happens with different approaches. Let us first consider what will happen if Kharn attacks normally. Kharn will do 4 hits to the target, which will benefit from the first part of Trajann's ability. Since that was a normal attack, it gets no additional hits. Kharn then uses the Betrayer and now does 4 hits plus 2 hits from the second part of Trajann's ability. All these hits will also benefit from the first part of Trajann's buff. Next, let's see what happens if Kharn uses his active ability. Kill, Maim, Burn does 3 attacks in a row, starting with 1 piercing hit, 6 eviscerating hits and then 1 plasma hit. Since the piercing attack hits first, this will get 2 additional hits from the second part of Trajann's passive ability. There will be no additional hits to the eviscerating or plasma attacks, but all 3 attacks will benefit from the first part of Trajann's passive ability. That Kill, Maim, Burn just went from dangerous to brutal. Next, let's compare the damage output of some small attack sequences using Kharn and Ragnar, with Trajann being there to buff. In the first example, we will simply use Kharn's active ability unbuffed to set the baseline. In the second example, we will Howl, move in with Ragnar to activate half the buff, then attack with Kharn's active ability. This will deal more damage than the baseline case, but still not the full extent. In the third example, we will Howl with Ragnar, then move in both him and Trajann to activate the full buff before using Kharn's active ability. As you can see, this sequence deals the most damage. As illustrated, Kharn's active ability can have very different damage outputs depending on how you sequence your attacks when under Trajann's buff. For completeness, let's just add that since Ragnar's ability does not affect abilities, the best damage output from Kharn in the turn that Ragnar does a Howl would be attacking normally. We will Howl, move in with Ragnar to activate Trajann's buff, then attack with Kharn's normal attack. I hope that has given you some insight into how the buff works and how you activate it. This is general information, so apply it to whatever characters you have. In the next 2 videos, I will first show you why Trajann is the best buffer for the Admech raid team and how you play him in that lineup, and then how you make and play with the raid team that synergizes with the full extent of Trajann's godlike buff. I hope you will follow along in this journey to learn everything there is to Trajann and his synergies, so please like and subscribe to my channel so you will get notified when the next episode drops. Until next time, bye bye.